Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving straight into one of the most profound, honestly, most devastating events in human history, the Great Irish Famine. But as we're going to see today, we are unpacking a story that is way more complex and, frankly, deeply unsettling than just some simple crop failure.
Think about this. What if the deadliest disaster in a nation's history wasn't actually an act of nature, but a colossal failure of politics? You know, it's this incredibly common myth that the Irish Potato Famine was purely a biological accident, right? Just this unavoidable tragedy of nature. But when you take a closer look at the historical data, well, it reveals a completely different reality.
Section 1. The perfect crop, a dangerous dependency.
So to really get how this disaster happened, we first need to set the scene in mid-19th century Ireland. How exactly did a South American vegetable become the absolute, literal cornerstone of an entire nation's survival? Well, for over 200 years, the potato thrived in Ireland's rough terrain and unpredictable weather. It was packed with carbs, vitamins, minerals, a nutritional powerhouse that made it super easy for less wealthy families to actually maintain a balanced diet. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Think about the sheer scale of this dependency. By the mid-1800s, Ireland had about 8.5 million residents, and because British mandates essentially forced the systematic export of Ireland's more valuable agricultural products, we're talking grain, livestock, all the good stuff, roughly half the country's population was forced to live almost entirely on potatoes. They were pushed right to the edge, into a highly precarious single-crop dependency just to survive. Section 2. The catalyst. The Blight strikes. Which brings us to the fall of 1845. Harvesting begins, and farmers head out into their fields, only to find their bright green potato plants have just rotted, yielding these blackened, shriveled potatoes. And anyone desperate enough to eat them, they suffered severe stomach cramps, sometimes even death. The catalyst had officially arrived. Today, scientists actually know the exact biological culprit here. It's called Phytophthora infestans. Basically, it was a fungus. It likely originated in the Americas, hitched a ride across the Atlantic on trade ships, and when it hit Europe in 1845, well, it found this unusually damp weather that allowed it to spread like absolute wildfire. At the time, though, people simply called it the Blight. Now, the Blight didn't just hit Ireland. It actually destroyed potato harvests all across Europe. But here is the absolutely crucial difference in how different nations responded. Wealthier European countries generally fared way better. Why? Because they had ample alternative resources to draw on when the potatoes failed. Impoverished Ireland, on the other hand, especially in the southern and western regions, was entirely 100% dependent on this single crop. It's a textbook example of how the impacts of food insecurity always hit the hardest right at the poverty line. But listen, a failed harvest alone is just a class crisis. What happened next is how it spiraled into a total catastrophe. Section 3. A manufactured catastrophe. The government response. Remember, for centuries, Ireland had been under varying degrees of English control, and by 1845, it was governed straight out of London. The way that distant ruling body reacted to the crisis is exactly what turned a biological event into a manufactured national catastrophe. During that very first year of the famine, the British government rolled out three main policies. First, they imported corn from North America. The problem? It was terribly distributed and severely lacked nutrition, which took a previously healthy population and made them highly vulnerable to disease. It actually drove up maternal and child mortality. Second, they set up these intense public works projects. We're talking grueling manual labor, often located miles and miles away from where these starving workers actually lived. And third, actually scratch that, this is probably the most shocking part. They continued to heavily export Ireland's grain and livestock out of the country. So perfectly good food is leaving the ports while the local people are literally starving.
Section 4. The human toll, a microcosm of tragedy.
To really wrap our heads around the impact of those policies, we have to look past the macro-level economics. Let's zoom in on a specific story, a really heartbreaking microcosm of this whole tragedy. This is the story of Thomas Malone. He was just one of the countless laborers forced into those grueling public works projects we just talked about. To earn a totally meager wage, literally just to buy enough food to stay alive, Thomas walked 18 kilometers round trip to work, every single day, until one night, completely starved and exhausted, he collapsed on the road, dying just before he could even reach his front door. And the tragedy of Thomas Malone didn't end with him. He left behind a family of 7, a wife and 6 children. With their main provider literally worked to death by a system that was supposed to be offering relief, this family was left entirely to fend for themselves right in the middle of a famine. It's a devastating, chilling reality. And the worst part?
It played out for thousands of families just like his. So, despite the massive struggles of that first year, some folks did manage to scrape by. But then 1846 rolls around, and the crisis exponentially worsened. That unusually damp weather came right back, and the blight returned with an absolute vengeance. That year, a staggering 75% of Ireland's potato yield was completely wiped out. Only a quarter of the entire crop survived. The need for aid went from urgent to absolutely astronomical. So you'd think the government would step up, right? Actually, British relief efforts diminished substantially in that second year. The government restricted who was even eligible for aid and totally shifted the funding burden onto local Irish taxes. Modern historians are pretty much in consensus here. These disastrous policies didn't come from a lack of resources. They came from a lack of political will. Decision-makers in London were driven by really strict laissez-faire economic policies and internal political rivalries that just actively sabotaged any meaningful relief. On top of that, toxic religious ideology and prejudice played a massive role. You had British news sources callously depicting the Irish as lazy alcoholics, and some decision-makers literally believed the famine was a form of divine punishment.
It took 7 long years for Ireland's weather patterns to normalize and the potato crop to finally stabilize. But by then, the damage was totally irreversible. The macro-level toll is just staggering to look at. Over 1 million people perished from starvation, malnutrition, and disease. Between 1 and 2 million more flood the country on what they called coffin ships. This kicked off a massive demographic shift that literally halved Ireland's population. It plummeted from 8.5 million pre-famine to about 4.25 million by the 1920s.
Section 5. A modern warning. History repeating? The historical data is incredibly sobering, no doubt about it. But this explainer isn't just a history lesson. We really need to look at how this history acts as a very real, very urgent modern warning. There is a chilling, direct parallel here. Today, climate change is making extreme weather much more common and sustained. Just like the 19th century Irish who were devastated by damp weather and blight, modern agricultural communities are right now being devastated by extreme climate patterns. Both groups, marginalized, living right on the edge of the poverty line. And just like the Irish who were denied aid due to political prejudice, farmers today are facing starvation and disease because of global weather patterns that, frankly, they bear very little responsibility for. But you know, history doesn't actually have to repeat itself. If modern governments and institutions step up, we can prevent this. We just need to follow 3 absolutely crucial steps. 1. Coordinate ongoing relief efforts, not just one-off drops. 2. Provide sufficient nutrition to actually prevent disease rather than just handing out empty calories. And 3, most importantly, offer this aid with compassion rather than the judgment and toxic ideology that doomed millions back in the 1840s. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thoughts. As we face growing climate and food insecurity crises worldwide today, will we provide compassionate aid or let history repeat itself? The Great Irish Famine showed us exactly what happens when political will fails humanity. It is entirely up to us to make sure that the next time the crops fail, our humanity doesn't. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a clearer, structured understanding of what is a deeply complex historical tragedy. Keep asking questions and keep learning.